Hi, Misha here, and it's been a little bit since I've recorded model videos, just a lot of other things going on. Been really working with a lot of the main channel stuff, but we had something come in from Corgi that I just have to talk about. Not the thing that just fell behind me for no apparent reason. There really must be a ghost out here. Anyway, let's move on. In the past, you've seen this model in a video or two. This is an older Corgi C Harrier. You can tell by the older style stand. I've had this one for a while. It's a nice model, but aside from being dusty, it's pretty plain Jane C Harrier. Out of the blue, with actually little notification, Corgi released another C Harrier this summer. This is an FRS Fighter Reconnaissance Strike Mark 1, and complete with some armaments going on. So let's talk about some Harriers. In the past, we've mostly talked about the Hobbymaster Harriers, so let's give the Corgi design a little more due. These are, again, 1/72 scale die-cast metal. Let's start off with the older one, which is also an FRS. Although I'm not sure, it's got a few different antennae, so it could be one meant to be a later update, which happened a lot with these. The C Harrier is kind of an interesting story, and it really talks about British politics. In 1966, the next generation of large fleet carriers was canceled by a white paper. This left them operating the through-deck cruisers, the Invincible class, and so they would need something to operate from it. And at first they wanted something that was supersonic, maybe Mach 2, for fleet defense and reconnaissance. But the realities of the through-deck carriers, were just that. I mean, they were relatively small, so you needed a vertical takeoff or at least a short takeoff landing. So finally in 1972, authorization was given to proceed with a navalized version of a Harrier, and in 1975 it was ordered. The FRS Mark 1 is essentially a navalized version and an updated version of the Royal Air Force's GR3, and it had several improvements. Plus, it was optimized for operating in salt water. Mainly, it had a new canopy where it was nearly a foot higher with better visibility, more room for instrumentation for the pilot. It also had a lightweight, compact radar. It was cost-effective, although it did not have look-down, shoot-down capability. Still, it allowed it to fire medium-range air-to-air missiles. So for what it was, economical and dependable. They also had a slightly taller tail fin and just a few other little updates to the system. It had a max speed of a little over 700 miles per hour, maybe 730. Max altitude of a bit over 50,000 feet. It could lift about 8,000 pounds. It had a total of 5 hard points plus 2 more. The 4 under the wings could carry missiles, iron bombs, unguided bombs, or rocket pods, but typically 2 of them were almost always occupied by auxiliary fuel tanks to give it any type of range. There was another center line hard point that was not all that often used, and you had 2 additional hard points under the bellies, but those are for the 30 millimeter cannon pods, which held about 130 rounds each, I believe. And that was pretty much standard unless it wasn't armed at all. And that kind of gives you a idea of the setup here. Originally they wanted 24. Later the order was up to 34. And the plan was to have 6 on 3 different carriers. You had the Invincible herself, you had the Illustrious, named after a World War II carrier, and you had the Ark Royal, a name that goes back a long way. Well, they all do for that in the Royal Navy, but all named after previous carriers. And first test flight was in 1978, and the first production models were delivered to the Royal Navy in 1979, and they were doing sea trials through 1980, and it was considered fully ready for operations in 1981, which meant by April and May of 1982, it was just in time for the Falklands War, and thus to our model today. Alright, now we come to the 2022 FRS1 from Corgi. This is from the Falklands War. At this time, you had Invincible and another carrier, fourth carrier, Hermes, operating. Each was loaded up at the beginning of April with 10 Harriers, so a total of 20, and they would set sail, I believe it was on April 5th, after the Argentine military invaded the Falkland Islands and were preparing for combat. They would be joined en route close to the area in May by 8 more Sea Harriers, plus they would operate alongside Air Force GR-3s. Basically, the Air Force Harriers would be responsible for close air support, ground attack, and the Sea Harriers would pretty much be there for air-to-air defense, combat, that kind of thing, although not exclusively. And hostilities would begin, at least for as far as these Harriers were concerned, around May 20th, and very soon this Harrier here would distinguish itself. This one would actually drop 3 1,000-pound bombs, and more importantly, it would utilize its new AIM-9L sidewinders, which were just recently acquired from the USA earlier that year, replacing the older AIM-9Bs. And along with its gun pods, this airplane would be credited with shooting down 2 Israeli Dagger fighters and 1 old A4 Skyhawk that Argentina had refurbished and was using. It was actually the top scoring ace on board HMS Hermes, but it was not without some prices. Several GR3s were lost and about half a dozen FRS1s, although a lot of this was, through accidents and just mishaps that happened in combat. You know how the Falklands went. It wasn't categorically a victory, but they did effectively win. So this model here, it's got its 2 sidewinders and 2 gun pods, so it's in the air-to-air mode. If it wanted to carry iron bombs, it would have to shed one of those things. It's also worth pointing out, whereas the other Harrier has a white belly, this one has a gray. En route, crossing the Atlantic, both Hermes and Invincible, the 2 carriers sent, would quickly give their Sea Harriers a new paint job, a low visibility gray, kind of just spray painting them. So it's kind of a neat little thing. And afterwards, as we get into the 80s, production would continue, and we would have kind of a phase 1 update program, giving it more weapons capabilities, and then eventually this would lead to the what was known at the time as the FRS Mark II, which was first tested in 1988 and 1989, and would be later renamed the FA2 for Fighter Attack, which was an upgrade program for the FRS-1s, as well as some new build Sea Harriers in the 1990s. Let's take it off the stand for a moment. It's a pretty normal Corgi stand, plugs in the middle. The model has gear up or down, including the 2 middle and the 2 wingtip. The fuel tanks come attached. I would say permanent, but I'm sure you could pry them off. But the sidewinders are optional. You can plug those in or not. And some versions also have rocket pods. It does have some moving parts, for example, the 4 exhausts for the Pegasus engine. One thing that's kind of neat, and this one's new, so it may be very stiff, but one thing that is neat about the Corgi, unlike the Hobbymaster, they And it was going to do that. Oh, well. They all rotate. I told you it was sticky. In unison. So all four are geared together. So if you move one, they all move to kind of replicate actual function. It's a small thing, but I think it's pretty neat. Yeah, now that I've actually moved it once, they move fine. It's just because it's new. Anywho. And it's very metal. It's actually, even though it's a little plane, the real world aircraft is about 46.5 feet long, a little over 25 feet wide. This thing is pretty well metal. Metal tail, metal wings. We do have a cockpit with a pilot inside, although the pilot is not removable, and the cockpit is closed, which is fine by me. I do like Corgi models. They're pretty durable, and they do really well, in my opinion, with the British stuff, especially. Hobbymaster is probably objectively better, but they do tend to be a little more finicky, and the Corgis just seem to be a little more built to last. For example, having metal, I don't know how this stand goes in, metal high-tot tubes and things like that. You know, no one's perfect. Some brands do some things better than others, so you just kind of have to figure out. But I really like Harriers, and this one just kind of came in out of the blue, and I couldn't say no to it. Both together at the end. I was really hoping this one did have some missiles. That's kind of what I was going for. Or at least some iron bombs, because this one is in pretty plain format. Again, it has the original kind of white belly, and it's on the much older stand style. They would produce a total of about 111 Sea Harriers, most for the British, but not all. And the last new production and upgraded FRS1s to FA2 standard were done by 1998. And the plan was not to retire them until 2012. But in 2002, early retirement was announced. And so some of the later FA2s had very few hours on them. But already by 2004, they were being pulled out of the fleet. And by 2006, March, the last Sea Harrier was retired from the Royal Navy. I should mention, too, I mentioned Ark Royal earlier. At the time the Sea Harrier was being created, that was on the drawing board. Ark Royal herself would launch in 1985 and would carry these as well. Just thought I'd mention that. And then she would actually be decommissioned in 2010. Now the idea, back in 2002, we're going to replace these with this new fancy vertical takeoff, short takeoff and landing fighter called the JSF. What you know today is the F-35B. It was supposed to be in service around 2006, 2007. It was not. It would take another decade. So that actually left the Navy without much in the way of a fighter. They would actually operate some GR7s and GR9s from carriers for a brief period of time. But finally the F-35B would come around. And with the old Invincible class carriers being retired, well, this would lead to a bit of a shakeup in the Royal Navy, which we'll talk about next time. But for now, yeah, I just had a new model, and I know I haven't been talking much about airplanes lately, so I was kind of excited to show it to you. I like it. I just like Harriers. Well, this is Misha, and I will catch you very soon next time.